Chapter 1. It was an old-looking vine. Dusky, variegated leaves hunkered against a stem that wound in a stranglehold around the smooth trunk of a balsam fir. Sap drooled down the wounded bark, and dry limbs slumped, making it look as if the tree was trying to voice a moan into the cool, damp morning air. Pods stuck out from the vine here and there along its length, almost seeming to look warily about for witnesses. It was the smell that had first caught his attention, a smell like the decomposition of something that had been wholly unsavoury, even in life. Richard combed his fingers through his thick hair as his mind lifted out of the fog of despair, coming into focus upon seeing the vine. He scanned for others, but saw no one. Everything else looked normal. The maples of the Upper Ven forest were already tinged with crimson, proudly showing off their new mantle in the light breeze. With nights getting colder, it wouldn't be long before their cousin down in Heartland Woods joined them. The oaks, being the last to surrender in the season, still stoically wore their dark green coats. Having spent most of his life in the woods, Richard knew all the plants, if not by name, by sight. From when Richard was very small, his friend Zed had taken him along, hunting for the special herbs. He had shown Richard which ones to look for, where they grew, and why, and put names to everything they saw. Many times they just talked, the old man always treating him as an equal, asking as much as he answered. Zed had sparked Richard's hunger to learn, to know. This vine, though, he had seen only once before, and not in the woods. He had found a sprig of it at his father's house, in the blue clay jar Richard had made when he was a boy. His father had been a trader, and had travelled often, looking for the chance, exotic or rare item. People of means had often sought him out, interested in what he might have turned up. It seemed to be the looking, more than the finding, that he had liked, as he had always been happy, to part with his latest discovery so he could be off after the next. From a young age, Richard had liked to spend time with Zed while his father was away. Richard's brother Michael was a few years older, and having no interest in the woods or in Zed's rambling lectures, preferred to spend his time with people of means. About 5 years before, Richard had moved away to live on his own, but he often stopped by his father's home, unlike Michael, who was always busy and rarely had time to visit. Whenever his father went away, he would leave Richard a message in a blue jar telling him the latest news, some gossip or some sight he had seen. On the day 3 weeks before, when Michael had come to tell him their father had been murdered, Richard had gone to his father's house, despite his brother's insistence that there was no reason to go, nothing he could do. Richard had long since passed the age when he did as his brothers said. Wanting to spare him, the people there didn't want him to see the body, but still he saw the big, sickening splashes and puddles of blood, blown and thrown across the plank floor. When Richard had come close, voices fell silent, except to offer sympathy, which only deepened the riving pain. Yet he had heard them talking in hushed tones of the stories, of the wild rumours of things to come out of the boundary, of magic. Richard was shocked at the way his father's small home had been torn apart, as if a storm had been turned loose inside. Only a few things were left untouched. The blue message jar still sat on the step, and inside he found a sprig of the vine. It was still in his pocket now. What his father meant for him to know of it, he could not guess. Grief and depression overwhelmed him, and even though he still had his brother, he felt abandoned. That he was grown into manhood offered him no sanctuary from the forlorn feeling of being orphaned and alone in the world, a feeling he had known before when his mother died while he was still young. Even though his father had often been away, sometimes for weeks, Richard had always known he was somewhere, and would be back. Now he would never be back. Michael wouldn't let him have anything to do with the search for the killer. He said he had the best trackers in the army looking, and he wanted Richard to stay out of it, for his own good. So Richard simply didn't show the vine to Michael, and went off alone every day searching for it. For 3 weeks he walked the trails of the Heartland Woods, every trail, even the ones few others knew of, but he never saw it. Finally, against his better judgment, he gave in to the whispers in his mind, and went to the Upper Ven forest, close to the boundary. The whispers haunted him with the feeling that he somehow knew something of why his father had been murdered. They teased him, tantalized him, with thoughts just out of reach. They laughed at him for not seeing it. Richard lectured himself that this was his grief playing tricks, not something real. He had thought that when he found the vine it would give him some sort of answer. Now that he had, he didn't know what to think. The whispers had stopped teasing him, but now they brooded. He knew it was just his own mind thinking, and he told himself to stop trying to give whispers of life of their own. Zed had taught him better than that. Richard looked up from the big fir tree in its agony of death. He thought again of his father's death. The vine had been there. Now the vine was killing this tree. It couldn't be anything good. Though he couldn't do anything for his father, he didn't have to let the vine preside over another death. Gripping it firmly, Richard pulled, and with powerful muscles ripped the sinewy tendrils away from the tree. That's when the vine bit him. One of the pods stuck out and hit the back of his left hand, causing him to jump back in pain and surprise. Inspecting the small wound, he found something like a thorn embedded in the meat of the gash. The matter was decided. The vine was trouble. He reached for his knife to dig out the thorn, but the knife wasn't there. At first surprise, he realized why, and reprimanded himself for allowing his depression to cause him to forget something as basic as taking the knife with him into the woods. Using his fingernails, he tried to pull out the thorn. To his rising concern, the thorn, as if alive, wriggled itself in deeper. He dragged his thumbnail across the wound, trying to snag the thorn out. The more he dug, the deeper it went. A hot wave of nausea swept through him as he tore through the wound, making it bigger, so he stopped. The thorn disappeared into the oozing blood. Looking about, Richard spotted the purplish-red autumn leaves of a small nannyberry tree, laden with its crop of dark blueberries. Beneath the tree, nestled in the crock of a root, he found what he sought, an almond plant. Relieved, he carefully snapped off the tender stem near the base, and gently squeezed the sticky, clear liquid onto the bite. He smiled as he mentally thanked old Zed for teaching him how to almond plant made wounds heal faster. The soft fuzzy leaves always make Richard think of Zed. The juice of the almond numbed the sting, but not his worry over being unable to remove the thorn. He could feel it wriggling still deeper into his flesh. Richard squatted down and poked a hole in the ground with his finger, placed the almond in it, and fixed the moss about the stem so that it might regrow itself. The sounds of the forest fell dead still. Richard looked up, flinching in the dark shadows, sweeping over the ground, leaping across limbs and leaves. There was a rushing, whistling sound in the air overhead. The size of the shadow was frightening. Birds burst from the cover of the trees, giving alarm calls as they scattered in all directions. Richard peered up, searching through gaps in the canopy of green and gold, trying to see the shadow's source. For an instant he saw something big and red. He couldn't imagine what it could be, but the memory of the rumors and stories of things coming out of the boundary flooded back into his mind, making him go cold to the bone. The vine was trouble, he thought again. This thing in the sky could be no less. He remembered what people always said, trouble sires 3 children, and he knew immediately that he didn't want to meet that 3rd child. Discounting his fears, he started running. Just idle talk of superstitious people, he told himself. He tried to think of what could be that big and red. It was impossible. There was nothing that flew that was that large. Maybe it was a cloud, or a trick of light, but he couldn't fool himself. It was no cloud. Looking up as he ran, trying for another glimpse, he headed for a path that skirted into the hillside. Richard knew that the ground had dropped off sharply at the other side of the trail, and he would be able to get an unobstructed view of the sky. Tree branches wet with the rain from the night before slapped at his face as he ran through the forest, jumping falling trees and small rocky streams. Brush snatched at his pant legs. Dappled swatches of sunlight teased him to look up, but denied him the view he needed. His breath was fast, ragged. Sweat ran cold down his face, and he could feel his heart pounding as he ran carelessly down the hillside. At last he stumbled out of the trees onto the path, almost falling. Searching the sky, he spotted the thing, far away and too small for him to tell what it was. But he thought it had wings. He squinted against the blue brightness of the sky. He shielded his eyes with his hand, trying to see for sure if there were wings moving. It slipped behind a hill and was gone. He hadn't been able to tell if it was really red. Winded, Richard slumped down to the granite boulder at the side of the trail. absently snapping off the dead twigs from a sapling behind him while he stared down at Trunt Lake below. Maybe he should go tell Michael what had happened. Tell him about the vine and the red thing in the sky. He knew Michael would laugh, and at the last part he had laughed at the same stories himself. No, Michael would only be angry with him for being up near the boundary, and for going against his orders to stay out of the search for the murderer. He knew his brother cared about him, or he wouldn't always be nagging him. Now he was grown. He could laugh off his brother's constant instructions, though he still had to endure the looks of displeasure. Richard snapped off another twig in frustration and threw it at a flat rock. He decided he shouldn't feel singled out. After all, Michael was always telling everyone what to do, even their father. He pushed aside his hard judgments of his brother. Today was a big day for Michael. Today he was accepting the position of first counselor. He would be in charge of everything now, not just the town of Heartland anymore, but all the towns and villages of Westland, even the country people, responsible for everything and everyone. Michael deserved Richard's support. He needed it. Michael had lost his father too. That afternoon there was to be a ceremony and big celebration at Michael's house. Important people were going to be there, come from the farthest reaches of Westland. Richard was supposed to be there too. At least there would be plenty of good food. He realized he was famished. While he sat and thought, he scanned the opposite side of Trunt Lake far below. From its height the clear water revealed alternated patches of rocky bottom and green weed around the deep holes. At the edge of the water, Hawker's trail knitted in and out of the trees, in some places open to view, in some places hidden. Richard had been out of that part of the trail many times. In the spring it was wet and soggy down by the lake, but this late in the year it would be dry, in areas farther north and south, as the trail wound its way through the high Ven forests. It passed uncomfortably close to the boundary. Because of that, most travelers avoided it, choosing instead the trails of the Heartland woods. Richard was a woods guide, and led travelers safely through the Heartland forests. Most were traveling dignitaries wanting prestige of a local guide more than they wanted direction. His eyes locked on something. There was movement. Unsure what it had been, he stared hard at the spot at the far side of the lake. When he saw it again in the path, where it passed behind a thin veil of trees, there was no doubt. It was a person. Maybe it was his friend Chase. Who else but a boundary warden would be wandering around up here? He hopped down the rock, tossing 2 twigs aside, and then took a few steps backwards. The figure followed the path into the open, and at the edge of the lake. It wasn't Chase, it was a woman in a dress. What woman would be walking this far out in Ven Forest in a dress? Richard watched her making her way up the lake shore, disappearing and reappearing with the path. She didn't seem to be in a hurry, but she wasn't strolling slowly either. Rather, she moved at the measured pace of an experienced traveller. That made sense. No one lived anywhere near Trunt Lake. Other movements snatched his attention. Richard's eyes searched in the shade and the shadows. Behind her there were others, 3, no 4 men, in hooded forest cloaks following her, but hanging back in some distance. They moved with stealth, from the tree to rock to tree, looking, waiting, moving. Richard straightened his eyes wide, his attention riveted. They were stalking her. He knew immediately. This was his 3rd child of trouble.